Next session is, in fact, in conversation with Ambassador Nirupama Rao by Srimati Nirupama Subramanian. So it's going to be a really interesting session here. Could I request everyone to please take seats, get settled, come ahead, come to the front. Those at the back and those outside the hall, I request them to please come ahead and take their seats. Before I invite both the lovely ladies on stage, of course, as we all know, Ambassador Nirupama Rao has been here with us since morning, and she was also received the Kalinga Karubaki Literary Award. So that's the development that took place in the morning. Is the second female Foreign Secretary of India. Was educated in India and joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1973. During her 4-decade-long diplomatic career, she has held several important assignments. Was India's first woman spokesperson in the Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi, the first woman High Commissioner from her country to Sri Lanka, and the first Indian woman ambassador to the People's Republic of China. She served as India's Foreign Secretary from 2009 to 2011. At the end of that term, she was appointed India's ambassador to the United States, where she served for a term of 2 years from 2011 to 2013. She is also the Counselor of World Refugee Council. And of course, joining her is Srimati Nirupama Subramanian, a resident editor of the Indian Express Chandigarh and the newspaper's nationalist editor responsible for news coverage of Jammu and Kashmir, Punjab, Himachal and Haryana. In a career of over 3 decades in print journalism, she has also worked at the Times of India, The Hindu, Sunday Observer and India Today. She has extensive experience of covering South Asia. She's reported from Sri Lanka for 7 years and from Pakistan for 4 years. Kashmir is her current obsession. For her coverage from Pakistan, she also won the Prem Bhatia Award for Best Political Reporting in 2008 and the Chameli Devi Jain Award for Best Woman Journalist in 2009. She's also a member of Track 2 Initiatives on India-Pakistan. As Neyman Fellow at Howard University, she wrote Sri Lanka, Voices from a War Zone, published by Penguin in 2005. She is an alumna of the Delhi School of Economics, Delhi University, and St. Xavier's College, Mumbai. Could I now request her to take this session forward? Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, folks. I think it's lunch has had its effect, and we don't have too many people in the audience, but I was telling Ambassador Rao, maybe that's just for the good. We can have, we can have a freewheeling discussion on the subjects that we both like. Ambassador Rao needs really no introduction. She, as she's already been introduced, I will just say that her experience as a diplomat is just one facet of her personality. She's a prolific writer. She is also, very few people know this, she is an accomplished and trained singer. And I'm going to play a song by her just now, which is actually very important in the context of what we are going to be discussing, which is international diplomacy and what it means to have relations that are not couched just in the language of conflict. What it means to have people-to-people relations. How do you build bridges with other nations? So I will request, and this, as she has just added, is her own composition. And there are actually 2 people in this. She is singing, and there is a very accomplished Sri Lankan pianist who's accompanying her on the piano. And I will request that the song be played. Peace is my dream. The song's name is Peace is My Dream.
I dreamt one day, one night, of a place of eternal light, in the mountain side. It was a place where we held hands in the valley of grace, when we were one, where we were one, and the tears of the dead were shed no more. Shed no more, and the words we said as never before, never before, above the sleeping dawn. Please, let's not for it, let's not bleed in war, bleed in war, bleed in war. Please, let's not for it, let's not bleed in war, bleed in war. My brother, my sister, look at that dog.
And it has been a privilege to have her perform with me. We call it Music Beyond Borders.
It's a great, it was a great effort, and it's actually it symbolizes everything that people-to-people contact stands for. I mean, usually we talk about people-to-people contact in terms of travel, in terms of you know, tourism, but this, I think, stands out as a collaboration that, you know, actually symbolizes what it can achieve, what people-to-people contact can really achieve. But you know, you were a hard-nosed diplomat when, you know, you're practicing international relations person, and what you were singing here, very idealistic. Is it actually possible? Can peace be achieved, and can people bring about peace independently of their states? Can people-to-people contact actually lead to peace? What I'm really saying, I think, is what are the limitations of this people-to-people contact?
And that diplomacy is about being hard-nosed and calculating. I have no doubt about that. And I guess, you know, professionally, you, of course, do your duty. You follow the policy line. You contribute also to the making of policy. But you can call this a kind of howling to the moon, I think, in some ways, because, you know, this is an appeal, I think, to that goes beyond cynicism. And I think for all of us to be truly creative and to, you know, bring out what we want to speak from the soul, I believe it's useful to express yourself in other mediums. And this is, of course, got nothing to do with diplomacy. It has a lot to do with my training in literature and my love of poetry. And basically, I'm a dreamer by nature, I think. My mother would always say when I was a little girl, "What are you dreaming about?" So I think I've retained that capacity.
So you're shattering our illusions and telling us that not all diplomats dream of peace.
Well, I think many of us get so seasoned and so sort of rooted in what we do that, in a sense, the other dimensions tend to tend to get a bit ossified, I would say, or are not expressed or not used for so long that you forget, you lose that muscle memory. We all have muscle memory, but sometimes you lose it when you don't exercise that enough. I think that's what happens. I don't believe anybody is against peace or dialogue. I have started a project in my retirement to set up a South Asian symphony orchestra. And it's essentially a peace-building process. My husband and I have set up a trust, really, and we have decided to contribute from our own savings into that trust to try and promote music among young musicians from our region, all the 8 countries, including the country whose name we dare not speak, Pakistan, including that. So we want to bring young talent together from these 8 countries to organize music workshops, to get very, master musicians from other countries, because it's an orchestra and they would play symphonic music. Which could be Western, it could be South Asian also. But we want to start that, and it's on the lines of the East-West Orchestra that was begun by Daniel Barenboim for Israelis and Palestinians. So something on those lines. So we've just begun, we had the first concert in Colombo in February this year, where we had Indian and Sri Lankan musicians perform together. And we had an Indian-American conductor from Houston. He flew down to conduct this concert, and it was beautiful, and we got some press coverage from it, and the kind of feedback that I got was so positive, which meant that we're not cynics, that we do dream about peace. I even had a most unexpected tweet from the Vice President of India.
Oh, very good.
And he said, this is a great initiative, it deserves support, so there's still hope, I think.
Right. So this talk about, not being cynical and actually having dreams, so brings me to another collaboration, which was, we saw recently, a book between two intelligence chiefs,
yes,
one from India and one from Pakistan. It has got a mixed reaction in both countries. In Pakistan, of course, General Asad Durrani, who was one of the authors, he has been pulled up, he has been put on the no-fly list, and on this side, Mr. Dulat, people have been sort of lukewarm about his participation. So there are limits to this kind of collaboration, I think. And where does it actually, what are those limits?
Yeah. I personally feel that, the professional domain and, the kind of work we do to promote peace and reconciliation and better communication in our region, I think there is, as somebody said, a Lakshman Rekha between the two.
Oh, is it just between India and Pakistan? I mean, if they had collaborated, if Asad Durrani had been a Sri Lankan instead of a Pakistani, would that have worked better? Would it have had a better reception in India? Would people have said, oh well, that's great, they've come out with their, with all these conversations, their dreams for peace in South Asia? Would that have worked better? Is peace with Pakistan, what I'm really asking here possibly is peace with Pakistan impossible? What do you think?
No, I personally, I'm not saying peace with Pakistan is not possible. I think we have to continue to strive for it, and the fact that we have, for 70 years not managed to move even a millimeter, I think it's a reflection on both our countries, I believe. And we need vision, we need farsightedness, we need boldness and courage, we need less hesitation on either side to move forward, to sort of structure a better relationship. It may not be a final resolution of all the problems that we have, but at least the traffic of relations in terms of people to people, in terms of trade, in terms of contact across the line of control like you had in Jammu and Kashmir for some time. Those are aspects, I think, that need to be sustained, because unless there is a sustaining of that momentum, it tends to decelerate, and then you have to start from scratch again, which is also, you know the kind of back-channel dialogue that existed at one point of time, and then political circumstances didn't prevent it from going forward. Having said that, I think whether, it was a Sri Lankan and an Indian collaborating, whether in this case you've had a Pakistani and an Indian, I think I've read through the book, I skimmed through the book actually, and I just felt that, where does it lead you? That was the question. Does it contribute to the total sort of kind of process that we need to reach the destination that I was speaking of? I think it was probably, a kind of burst of some, excitement about two intelligence chiefs talking about their, through conversation with the third person in this case, Mr. Sinha, talking about, some of their experiences. I just felt it did not really, in my view, the kind of note it struck for me as a professional, it didn't really strike very deep, to be very frank about. It didn't strike deep enough. So it may have benefited, the wider audience that wants to know what goes on, but as a professional, I can say this is not going to lead anywhere. This is just not going to lead anywhere.
So it had a fair amount of looking back at things that both men had been involved in, some in Kashmir, Kargil, the hijacking of the Indian Airlines plane to Kandahar. Yeah. It had many, many episodes. And here I want to know, I know you're writing a book yourself, when diplomats or when people who have held such offices as, as head of intelligence agencies, when they write memoirs, what is the extent to which they can go? What is the extent to which they can reveal things that went on in these high offices? Is there something like an oath of office that you cannot betray or cannot violate? Because we don't have a system of declassification of documents like other countries have. And so there seem to be people who take their chances, who just write, and if they get away with it, that's fine. And if they don't, well, let's take the consequences. That seems to be the kind of spirit. So in your own view, you're writing a book. Maybe you'd like to tell us about the book a bit as well, this book on China that you're writing. And how far do you go?
Well, having retired from the field of diplomacy, I now consider myself not just as I'm a citizen, of course, an ordinary citizen, but now a citizen Rao, exactly. And I have, of course, gone into academics in a manner of speaking. I've been teaching and I've been doing research. And I realized that when you're writing a book, you have to be very faithful to your sources. You have to be absolutely clinical about doing the right citations, about backing up whatever you are writing with, a reference to context. So I've tried to be as scrupulous as possible in my writing of the book on China that I'm doing. I'm writing a book on the politics of history, India and China, 1949 to 1962. And I've used a lot of archival material. I'm not writing something based on, I dealt with China for so many years. I was privy to the negotiations. I've, read all the internal files. No, I have not done that. Of course, I have the knowledge, I have the background, and I know what's, what happened and what did not happen. This would not be alternative news or fake news, definitely not. But whatever I'm saying, I'm backing up with reference to the archives. I've had access to the Nehru papers at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. I was given permission. And I've had access to some of the Chinese archives. I've had access to the British Foreign Office archives and a lot of published material. And that has worked for me. I'm doing that. But in the case of this other book that you spoke of, I mean, it's based on a conversation between two very highly placed individuals in their respective systems. And this is all recent history. And it's about events that have really not come to their logical conclusion as yet. You know, so one, I think, has to tackle these subjects with a lot of circumspection and a lot of, you know, awareness that what you are saying impacts policy, impacts public opinion. You don't want to speak falsehoods. I'm not saying you should say anything false or that you should exaggerate or you should spin. We don't want that. But I'm raising a question about, is this kind of a book necessary? Yeah. I'm referring to the Dulat Durrani book.
Okay. You know, I just want to move on from here to what's happening in diplomacy. It's been a really busy week for Indian diplomacy. I think it's been a busy 10 days perhaps. And we now have a new mental map of the world, and it's called the Indo-Pacific. And it used to be Asia-Pacific before, and now we're thinking about it as Indo-Pacific. And this new construct of a region stretches, as someone has put it, from Hollywood to Bollywood. But actually it stretches even further. It stretches to the coast of the Gulf countries. So, you know, how does this new construct, the strategic depth that it gives the United States, the role that it envisages for India, the role that it envisages for ASEAN, how is it all going to pan out in terms of how we have traditionally seen this region as a region of the rise of China? Is this setting up a new kind of conflict, or is it going to be, as Prime Minister Modi had, he mentioned in his speech at the Shangri-La dialogue? It was a very good speech, I thought. Very civilizational, very broad brush, very, you know, harking back on the links between the Swarnabhumi and India and all that. And he mentioned 5 S's on which international relations should be based. Let me see if I've got them written down. He said, yeah, there's Samman, which is respect, Samvad, which is dialogue, Sahyog, which is cooperation, Shanti, peace, and Samriddhi, prosperity. He laid out these 5 as the cornerstone, touchstones of the new thinking for this region, for the Indo-Pacific region. How do you see this actually working out on the ground? India itself had to do a balancing act. Immediately after the Shangri-La dialogue, we're going to have tomorrow in Qingdao, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. India had itself you know, recently had this meeting, India and China had the meeting, the summit in Wuhan. So clearly there's a balancing act by India as well. So, I mean, what is it that we see? Is it smoke and mirrors? Is it shadow? Is it a shadow fight going on? What is it? Can you explain this to us?
Well, I think the Indo-Pacific, the term has been in use for some years now. And, you know, the Australians talked of it a few years ago. And when Prime Minister Abe of Japan was here in 2007, when he addressed the parliament, he spoke of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So the parlance we're aware of. But it so happens that now the United States has renamed the Pacific Naval Command as the Indo-Pacific Command. And yes, it now, what it implies is that the presence of India, the role of India, the part that India can play in this whole dimension of the oceans that, you know, thinkers like Mahan spoke about. You know, you had Mackinder and Mahan, Mackinder speaking about the rimland and Mahan speaking about the oceanic space. Suddenly, our oceanic frontiers, this has been pushed much more into focus. India is essentially a peninsular country. I mean, we've always thought of the Himalayas as our crown, but the seas at our feet, they make us very much a seafaring nation. Our history is testimony to that, is witness to that. The Bay of Bengal, for instance, if you've read Sunil Amrit's wonderful book about crossing the Bay of Bengal, it speaks so vividly and so powerfully about the migrations, the trading communities, our links with Southeast Asia. I mean, sitting here in Orissa, this is so vividly portrayed in the history of this part of the country and its links with Southeast Asia. So the definition of the term Indo-Pacific, I think it's an idea whose time has come, and what it poses in terms of the challenge to India is that, you know, we've spoken about the 5 principles that Prime Minister Modi articulated at Shangri-La. In fact, these 5 principles were what the BJP National Executive had articulated about 2 or 3 years ago. In fact, I was doing some work on a piece on Indian foreign policy, and I came across this. And he's reiterated it in Singapore, which is a good thing. I think all these 5 principles, nobody can have any objection to it. My question is, India wants to be a leading power. When you look at the Asia Power Index, which the Lowy Institute in Australia brought out a few days ago, looking at the power index, you have the US as the most powerful country. And then you have China very close behind. And then many points below that, Japan and India. So the US and China are termed as the superpowers. Well, China is almost there, but it seems to have gotten into that category. Japan and India are termed as the major powers. But the gap between the superpower category and the major power category is still many, many points. Our strengths, obviously, are our economic potential. We are the fastest growing economy in the world. But there's a lot of catching up to do. Military, good. Diplomatic influence, impressive. But how do we leverage all this is the question. You mentioned Southeast Asia. Now we have the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, very close to the coast of Sumatra, and Prime Minister Modi was in Indonesia. It's very good that we are paying attention to Indonesia. I've long felt that we've neglected Indonesia. We've gone with all the bigger countries and the more sort of economically successful countries. But it's time we paid attention to Indonesia. I mean, it is the giant in Southeast Asia. Similarly, our Northeast. I talked of bridge building in the morning. You know, it's not just a question of building linkages, but it's a question of building bridges also. And Southeast Asia begins in Northeast India. Literally, Southeast Asia begins in Northeast India. And I've always said that India is a multi-regional country. We think of ourselves as South Asian, but we're also Southeast Asian. We're also Central Asian. If you look at Kashmir's original linkages with Central Asia, with Xinjiang, the trading that went, you know, we've lost all that. So it's time we kind of leveraged these potential capabilities of ours, which is why our participation in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a good thing, which is why we should be, while resetting our relationships with China, we should be talking about the linkages that we had, Northern India had with Chinese Central Asia. You know, why is it just that the Pakistanis are operating that linkage today? You know, you have flights that from Pakistan to China that fly over the Karakoram, so much so that from Islamabad to Beijing, you can do a journey in 4 hours. It's because of this special relationship that China has with Pakistan. I think we should be out there stressing and articulating our interests much more clearly and much more in that hard-nosed way than we have so far.
So is there, I mean, the one question that is always asked, and I don't think anybody has the perfect answer to it, but let me ask you again this question. Is there room for both India and China in this region?
I think that I mentioned this also in a talk I gave at the Indian Institute of Science 2 days ago in Bangalore, that the real binary today in the Indo-Pacific is the US-China binary. And if you listen to the speeches of Prime Minister Modi at Shangri-La and the speech by US Defense Secretary Mattis at the same forum, you can see the contrast. Yes. I mean, ours was very sotto voce, you know, to use a musical term. I think we were very, you know, softly hinting at the threat from China, at, you know, the way the region should look at a rule-based order, why we shouldn't be drawn into, you know, a burden, unbearable, unsustainable burden of debt. He was referring, obviously, to the way the Chinese are going about economic projects. Whereas Mr. Mattis, you know, had a very, what you call in international relations theory, a very realistic approach to the situation in the Indo-Pacific. He spoke about the coercion and intimidation, these were the words he used, of the Chinese in the region, about their building artificial islands in the South China Sea, about threatening, you know, the smaller countries, and about militarizing the area. You know, he was very, very direct. And he even used the word that, you know, there could be conflict, there could be tension. So this is really, you know, the drama you're seeing playing out in the region. Now, the US would obviously like India to play a much more active role. In a sense, they're not saying it, but obviously taking on the Chinese a little more, you know, being a little more prickly, being a little more assertive. But I think, you know, we have to understand ultimately that geography, the logic of geography is relentless. We are where we are in our region. We have an unsettled border with China, an 3,500 kilometer long unsettled border. There are conflicting territorial claims. We have much more to do in terms of our coastal defenses, in building up our capability. We need time, obviously. You know, it's obviously not a situation where we can go whole hog with what the US is saying. We have to draw some kind of a balance. So, when to answer your question, is this going to be a confrontational situation between India and China? I think we'll have to manage this. The potential definitely for competition is there. Is there potential for conflict? I'm sure if we, you know, looking at the unresolved border, looking what happened at Doklam last year, we know the scenarios that are possible. But it will require a lot of maturity on the part of both countries to ensure that situations are handled in a way that they do not escalate to the point of conflict and beyond. Because it doesn't work to either country's interest, and it certainly does not work to our interest to be drawn into that kind of, you know, eventuality with China, because we have so much miles to go before we sleep in this country. Miles to go.
Absolutely. Prime Minister Modi also spoke at Shangri-La about how there can be competition and there can be contests, but these need not be rooted in conflict. I mean, they need not lead to conflict. They can coexist in a sort of cooperative way. But I'm not very sure. I'm a realist myself, and I'm not so sure that countries think like that, because I think every country thinks about its borders, its territory, its and the space that it needs, the mental space. I don't mean Lebensraum as in the in the German sense, but in the mental space that it needs in the world, and its economy, its trade linkages. So, I'm not very, I'm not an optimist on this as such. But where does that leave? I mean, this Indo-Pacific is a very, it's a new concept, and it's it's generating a lot of optimism. We see already a meeting of the Quad has taken place, which is India, US, Japan, and Australia. They've suddenly got their act together. They met yesterday. Where does this leave SAARC? I mean, India's relations with its neighbors should be really important. I mean, for us, we are the biggest country in this region, and we have traditionally seen ourselves as leaders of this region. Of course, Pakistan has vied for that space in terms of its military prowess, its nuclear capability, but as an economic power, as a democracy, as a country that has several knowledge hubs, all that, we have seen ourselves as leaders. But our relations with all the countries in the region have been sort of far from good. I'm not saying just in the recent past, but they've been indifferent over the years. And there seems to be no solution to this. Part of it is also because India is the biggest country, and smaller countries see, there's a little bit of envy, there's a little bit of fear, there's anger, there's all these things combined. So, how do we resolve this?
Well,
and there's China.
Yeah.
Sorry.
The other big country.
Yeah.
Well, as far as the Quad is concerned, I think it's a very good idea for us to, to work from the right and left sides of our brain on this. Like we mentioned earlier today. We are democracies, all the 4 countries, and we have an authoritarian China that is very agnostic about the way it transacts relations. I mean, it supports, the regimes whose, there are corrupt leaders that they have supported. There are authoritarian tendencies in governments that they seem to have no quarrel with. And I think politics without principle, as Gandhiji said, I think is not something that we would like at all to be identified with. So it makes sense for us to have closer dialogue and a coalition of interests, at least, even if we don't have alliances, with democratic countries in the region. And that's why the relationship with Japan, with Australia, with Singapore, another very important country, they're all, I think, worth pursuing with tenacity. And that's the right way to go. So it's a good direction. Coming to South Asia, talking of democracy, I remember Meghnad Desai saying long ago that India may not become a superpower, in our lifetimes at least, in my lifetime definitely, but we can be the world's greatest democracy, definitely. We have, all the kind of indices in terms of population, in terms of, the constitution, the systems we chose, the elections we have, but we obviously have to, do much more of a job trying to clean up whatever needs to be cleaned up, to embrace diversity more, wholeheartedly, to avoid majoritarian tendencies. And that's how we can become the greatest democracy. And I think that is a good goal to be pursuing on your route to becoming a superpower. I think we should keep that in mind. Coming to South Asia, yes, we are the biggest country in the region. We are the most dominant country. We are the most powerful economically and militarily. And we are a nuclear weapon power also to boot. Now, in the South Asian region, Lakshman Kadirgamar, whom you also knew, the assassinated foreign minister of Sri Lanka, would always say South Asia is an integer. It is, it is the subcontinent of old, south of the Himalayas, north of the Indian Ocean. I mean, essentially, it's that region. And there is an idea that we should be talking much more about, called the South Asian Commons. You're from Tamil Nadu, you know the word Perambok. Yeah. It's really land which is, seen as community land where, you don't pursue individual interests with a sense of dogma. It's a question of, sharing, it's a question of consulting with others. So think of South Asia like that, a South Asian Commons. How much have we promoted that? The SAARC has sort of, it's going nowhere. I think our political issues that divide us have come in the way. So we have to now think very seriously about how do we promote this idea of a South Asian Commons where the smaller countries in the region, I'm not talking of Pakistan, of course, that's a completely different trajectory, and we have to apply different formulae perhaps to that. But the other countries in the region, take Nepal, for instance, or Sri Lanka. There's a principle in economics, I forget the name of the only woman Nobel Prize economics winner. She had this theory about fairness in relations between individuals, that a relationship can go nowhere if one party in the relationship feels that they're not getting a good enough deal.
Only a woman could have thought about that.
Only a woman could have thought about that, exactly. That's why I talk about a feminist foreign policy also. So that is something we should be cogitating about. Many of us, I think, we proceed from the assumption that we're the biggest country and, daddy knows best kind of, approach. I think that we have to really introspect a little more about it and understand that with our smaller neighbors, we need to give them a little more comfort, a little more sense of non-reciprocity, that we tend to apply a little mechanically, although the Gujral doctrine and the Manmohan doctrine said that they were going beyond that. But we still haven't got there, I feel, on that.
So how far is, sorry, we're running out of time, but I
ask them if they have any questions.
Yeah, just one, I was just going to ask you about how far does this cultural diplomacy take us with our South Asian neighbors, Buddhism, Hinduism, common cultural links, all this, how far will that work towards improving? I mean, there seems to be a new emphasis on that. Is that going to help us win friends and allies in the good friends in the neighborhood? We are friends, I think most of us do have friendly ties, but I think they tend to hit rough patches every now and then.
I think, as far as our cultural influence goes, it's very strongly felt in South Asia. In Sri Lanka how our movies are. And you have many Sri Lankans who don't learn Hindi, who learn it through the Bollywood songs and understand it very well as a result. So I think there's a kind of free-flowing influence back and forth that happens as far as our culture is concerned. Now, if you talk of cultural diplomacy as us going, all engines sort of working on, I think we have to be a little sensitive in our own region about the way we transact cultural diplomacy. Farther afield, it's fine in Southeast Asia and the rest of the world. I think we really need to pay more attention to cultural diplomacy as an arm of our diplomacy in other fields. But in South Asia, it has to be a combination of realism. We spoke of realism. It has to be a combination of liberalism, the stressing of the democratic values and interdependence, connectivity, communication. And it has to be the constructive part where we speak about culture, common origins, language, ethnicities, spirituality, all that. It has to be a combination, imaginative, creative, appealing, and not coming on too strong, I think.
I think that's important because the minute that happens, people recoil and suspect motives. I'd like to open this out to questions from the floor, if there are any. Yes, please. Will you please identify yourself as well? Yeah, you could take this. Actually. No problem. Am I audible? Yeah, you. Okay, fine.
My question was the Sino-Indian. So we had a war with China, as we know it. There is a Doklam crisis.
We didn't have a war in Doklam, no. We had a near confrontation. bloodshed? No?
No, sorry, I'm saying about the Indo-Chinese War.
1962. Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. So we had a confrontation. Golkham is later part. So that was that part only. Now the Golkham crisis was there. At that time, India was not that a powerful country when we faced China. With 12,000 soldiers, there's 80,000 soldiers from the Chinese side. The Chinese infiltrated right into it and we put to nothing. We were like sitting ducks at that time. The Nehru's at that time forward post policy, which he occupied at during that point of time, that to guard it, you guard that one out, which is out of your post. That triggered the Chinese right into the Indian, which was not really, and most of the time they thought that it's a military matter, not a political matter. Nehru didn't raise it up. Fine, that is the past. Today, when Golkham crisis was there, we resolved it out. We saw today ours was in a fairly better position to negotiate than we had in that. My point here is that there was a point of time even when Israel was a weaker nation, the Arab countries surrounding it. But it was very deterministic. It stood its ground. And today, even it's a clear factor in that position. Today, we are importing goods, we are importing defense products from Israel. Why is this soft policy of ours? Why will it take us in the report? How far we are justified in taking this policy where we are saying, oh, we are friends. There was also another instance, I can just take just to shorten a bit. There's always a proverb that enemy is my friend. That's Pakistan. But now, even enemy's friend, I can make it my friend. Example, Nepal. Now, there was a crisis between the Prime Minister of India and that of the Prime Minister of Nepal. The problem which was occurred between them. China has given a lot of funding after the earthquake, right towards Nepal with India standing over. Under these circumstances, when China is now building most of the friendships with Nepal, whereas India is more closer to Nepal in cultural terms, how far are we progressing?
Okay, that's
How far is what?
how far.
How far we are progressing?
We are
Like
progressing.
how far? We can say that we will be ready to face a kind of a superpower.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but I want to ask you a counter question. Do you have any prescriptions, sir, that you could tell me how to handle China and how to handle Nepal?
I'm not pushing, I'm just a point that I'm raising right now.
You did have actually. You pointed to Israel as an example that
Yes,
you
yes,
follow.
exactly. I wanted to point out Israel as an example where Israel takes a very hard stand on things. We know about the recent cases also, where Israel took it, recent matters, while the Syria crisis was going on. We took a hard stand, and somehow it is acknowledged for that. My point is this: because we are not acknowledged for our soft side dignity.
I couldn't understand exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, you know, but he said Israel, when it takes a hard stand with its neighbors and when it does things, that it's acknowledged for that. Maybe it means respected, but we are not respected for our soft stand.
Well, I think, it's very difficult to apply the analogy of Israel to India. First of all, we are not Israel. Let us not delude ourselves about being a wannabe Israel, as the Americans would say. We are not a wannabe Israel. We're not going to be one either. The Israeli situation is completely different from ours. Israel is a monolithic construct. It is the Jewish homeland. You can argue that we are the Hindu homeland. I mean, you can say that. But we are a complex, plural, diverse nation molded by a history that is so different from Israel's. So let's forget about that. The other thing is the Arab nations and China, don't compare the two. It's like these are two different categories. Now, Israel gets a lot of criticism from its treatment of the Palestinians, from its presence in the Gaza Strip, from the occupied territories. Let's not go into that, because I think I think it doesn't make sense for us to compare our situation with Israel's. Just to say that Israel is strong and it shows its muscle, why can't we be like it? It's like saying, we used to have those advertisements in the old days about what was it? I think, you know, they would have this image of an African man with muscles saying, you know, you take this medicine and you can become like him. It's not as simple as that. It's not at all as simple as that. We have a whole border with China that is in contest. 3,488 kilometers of a land border with China. Secondly, China has leaped ahead of us in the last 30 years because of their open door economic policies. We were a little late getting on the train. We're trying to get there, but there is a gap of about 4 to 5 times difference in GDPs between India and China.
So, I was reading your paper that you, the speech that you had in Bangalore the other day, and according to the Lowy statistics, that study they did, the gap between China and India is the same as the gap between Japan and Bangladesh. Just to put it in perspective.
So let's be realistic about it. How are we to go about handling China? It's about having intelligent partnerships with the United States, with the countries like Japan. Japan, it's a very important relationship for us. But you know, we have to understand that we have a next door neighbor. We have an unresolved border. We have to be ensuring that we do not get into situations where, you know, nobody is going to come to our rescue. Look at Doklam last year. Who supported us on Doklam? And you forget the fact that Doklam took place in Bhutan. And my friend, Bhutan doesn't belong to us. This is the problem. We think in South Asia that these smaller countries are like, you know, they have to just come at our beck and call. It's not going to happen, my friend. It will not happen that way. It's time we grew up a little. I think we don't have a grown-up attitude to these things. We are wailing and whining about situations where you are not looking realistically at these situations. It's all very well to condemn Mr. Nehru, and I agree that there were certain strategic errors made in the pre-62 period. But there was also the role of public opinion. From the time of the invasion of Tibet by China in 1950, there was a school of thought within the cabinet, among the Congress party, that, you know, you had to take a hard line. And tell me, what kind of a hard line? The maximum hard line you could have taken was to leave the endorsement of Tibet being a part of China open. I agree. You could have said, you know, we can't say that at the moment because we have to sort out a number of issues arising out of treaty obligations between British India and Tibet. Like, that's where the problem with the McMahon line comes, you know, the whole issue of the border in Arunachal Pradesh. Okay, so we could have said, we want to hold, we want, as they say in in aeronautical terminology, we'll keep it in holding pattern for some time. We're not going to have any takeoffs and landings. We're going to keep it in holding pattern till we sort out the issue of the border. That's where I agree we could have been a little more smart and a little more, had a little more foresight. But even then, in 1950, no country, the United States, the UK, everybody washed their hands off. Everybody washed their hands off. Here we are, a new nation, struggling after partition, struggling with a whole heap of problems. You have to, you know, throw back to the early 50s to see the situation we were in. I don't think anybody could have, at that moment, said Nehru could have had the hindsight to realize, you know, that China was invading Tibet, that we should have, you know, said that the status of Tibet is undecided. And mind you, what people were saying is that we should take a hard line on Tibet. It would have got us nowhere unless we had a well thought out strategy. That, you know, we took the line that the border was settled. If you look at the 50s, you know, to and fro between India and China, India was taking the line that the border is settled. The Chinese were saying the border is not settled. So we should have at that moment decided, look, we have to sit down with the Chinese and sort this out. There were many, many issues where I think a little bit of deeper thinking could have avoided the kind of problems that we encountered. And then, of course, public opinion took over in Parliament, and then we had the problems in Tibet. The Dalai Lama came to India. Everybody's sympathy, rightfully so, was with the Dalai Lama. So much to learn, and that's why I'm writing a book about that period, because I would like people in this country, whoever reads it, to understand this situation better, to understand that it was not easy for us. It was not easy for us, and today we are still dealing with the legacy of those years. So when you say, let's take a hard line with China, why are we so soft? I think the word soft in India seems to suggest, something that is weakness. It's nothing to do with weakness. And it's not about softness, it's about being realistic.
Pragmatic.
Pragmatic, yes, realistic, pragmatic, and understanding history better.
Any more questions? Yes.
On the basis of your experience for a long time in the Ministry of External Affairs, as I understand,
Yes,
am I audible?
yeah.
As I understand, Indian diplomacy is a continuous process. And the diplomats working in the South Bloc, they are tuned to it right from day one. But the political leadership of India keeps changing. The complexion of the political leadership of India changes every 5 years, maybe after every 10 years. How do you cope up with this? Do you enjoy that sort of independence and fearlessness to speak out your brain, to speak out your diplomatic heart and brain very candidly on the face of the political leadership who tries to take a different route, deviating from the traditional diplomatic approach with different countries? I would like to hear you, I would like to hear it from you on the basis of your any experiences which, you very candidly put before the political leadership, they disagreed, or you diplomats fine-tune your language to suit or to keep the political leaders in good humor. Thank you.
Well, I can speak from my experience in the Ministry of External Affairs that the political leadership has always preferred to be guided by the advice of the bureaucrats, of the career foreign service people who work in the Ministry of External Affairs, who have the background, who have the experience, who have the knowledge of a particular bilateral relationship that you have, or of the multilateral issues involved. So I have never seen political interference in decision making in the foreign ministry. It may be happening in other ministries, it may be happening in the IAS, it may be happening at the level of the state governments, but that is not the norm, that is not the normal in the foreign ministry. So I think the foreign ministry bureaucracy has a very powerful role to play in molding the opinions of the politicians in regard to foreign policy issues.
Is it because there's been, you could say that there's been continuity over the years, whatever the government, whichever party comes to power, there's been some sort of continuity in foreign policy. Is it broadly right to say that, even now over the last 4 years?
I would think so. The reset, let me put it like this, the reset you're seeing with China, what they call a reset, the Wuhan summit, and the fact that, we've started dialoguing more concertedly, I think it's a reflection of the bureaucracy's advice, definitely, definitely.
And even the speech in Shangri-La, it's been described as very Nehruvian. I read a commentary saying that this is exactly Nehru's.
I would say that it was, something that you would, a standard text that you would pick out and embellish and articulate. I wouldn't say Nehruvian so much as, a kind of very orthodox presentation that a foreign ministry would have drafted.
Yeah, because interestingly, it also included a line saying inclusiveness, and there was a line about inclusiveness, which I thought was...
inclusiveness, pluralism, diversity. In fact, Pratap Bhanu Mehta's commentary on the Shangri-La dialogue was exactly about that. He said that, you know, it's very good. He used the word Nehruvian, that it was Nehruvian in its articulation, in its tone, and in the kind of message it gave to the region, and perhaps we need to turn the searchlight inwards a little.
Yeah. Yes. So if there are no more questions, we will wrap up the session and hand over to the next. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to the esteemed panel. Could I now request the KLF team member, Mr. Sitanshu, to please come here on dais and felicitate our esteemed panel here. Ambassador Nirupama Rao and Nirupama Subramanian. They share the same name. Same passion as well. True. So can we have a round of applause for both of them? Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, we will now move to our next session.